Hi and welcome to Power Play on this Friday, November 21st. I'm Mike Lecouteur in Ottawa. Tonight, making a deal with the UAE.
The opportunity to take our partnership to a new level, and we will deliver on that in the next year.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has arrived in South Africa for his first G20, but his suitcase is a little heavier. That's because he's inked a $70 billion investment deal with the United Arab Emirates. It comes as International Trade Minister has launched a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure program to spur investment here at home. How's it going to work? We'll hear from Minister Sidhu in just moments. Then, Premier Eby versus Premier Smith.
We are making a very, very strong case that building a new pipeline to Asian markets is in the national interest.
I've reached out to Ottawa to express that business in British Columbia should be discussed with British Columbia at the table.
BC and Alberta are at odds as David Eby says he's been excluded from negotiations on a new federal pipeline. Our front bench will break down the interprovincial energy dispute. Today, we've got Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, and Carl Belanger. Plus, the debate over the notwithstanding clause. How far will the feds go in pushing back against the province's use of the controversial clause? We'll ask Justice Minister Sean Fraser. First, though, Prime Minister Mark Carney has touched down in Johannesburg, South Africa for the G20 summit. He's landing with a little extra bounce in his step after wrapping up a visit to the United Arab Emirates. While there, he announced a $70 billion investment deal with the UAE, and the two countries are launching free trade talks.
We're doing two things here, principally, apart from meetings with government officials, the private sector, and investors. The first was to sign what's called a FIPA, Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreement, which basically does what it says, which is to protect investors both ways and provide certainty for the investment environment. And then secondly, and very importantly, we agreed yesterday, the President and I agreed, to launch a free trade agreement process known as a CEPA, so it's broader than free trade. It would include digital and other aspects of trade.
Also today, the Liberal government announced two new infrastructure funds totaling $6 billion. Now, Ottawa claims the investment could help generate $300 billion more in exports. How will that happen? Well, that's the question CTV's chief political correspondent Vashi Kapelos asked International Trade Minister Minister Sidhu.
We're creating an ecosystem to support businesses to get out there and diversify trade. Look, 25 years ago, trade with the U.S. was almost 90%. Now it's down to around 75%. And I know, look, the U.S. will always be an important trading partner, but we need to make sure that we're creating more opportunity for Canadian businesses, and that's exactly the mandate that Canadians have given us.
I guess that what I would respectfully challenge you with is, I understand that you're trying to set the conditions, but so was the previous government for the last 10 years, right? You're referencing a number of decades ago. Over the last 10 years, it pretty much stayed at 75% of all of our exports going to the United States. But under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Liberals signed Canada-Ukraine Free Trade, CETA, CPTPP, CUSMA, well, separate from CUSMA, Chile, Israel, United Kingdom, like a whole bunch of free trade agreements that did not materialize in a germane difference. And I wonder what you would tell Canadians today is so different about this, other than Donald Trump doesn't want as much of our business.
Well, the difference is the government can set the policies, every day of the week. But until businesses start using those policies, those trade agreements, it's not going to move the needle. And now businesses are now matching the energy of the government, saying we want to get into new diversified markets. Help us get there. You look at the CAN export funding. We're revitalizing that program. 65% of the funding roughly was used for U.S. diversification efforts in the past. I'm looking at that program and saying, okay, how can we utilize that program so we're targeting other markets outside the U.S. To diversify trade? And so there's a big difference than what was happening last year in our country to what it is now, where business energy is at. We talk with the boards of trade. I spent some time with them all summer, the last few months. The chambers of commerce are all asking for this. They're asking now to help them get into new external markets.
Well, Vashti's full interview with Minister Sidhu will air on CTV's Question Period this Sunday. Now, the reason for diversifying trade is because of the ongoing threat of tariffs imposed by the U.S. and President Donald Trump. Now, Vashti also spoke to Ontario's Trade Representative David Patterson, and he gave her the latest view from D.C.
I'm back in Washington, and I do actually see a number of things that are sort of changing in the discussion from our interactions with business and Congress, even just this week. Everybody wants to see inflation kept down, and they want to see the economy moving forward down here in Washington. And just in the last couple of weeks after the shutdown, people coming back from their districts, I think they're getting an earful, and they want to get on with it.
That interview will also be aired in full Sunday on Question Period. The conversation also touches on the state of trade talks with the U.S. and Patterson's own position after an anti-tariff ad by his premier, Doug Ford, featuring Ronald Reagan, angered President Trump. But Canada does have other allies in D.C. Now, a number of senators have opposed the tariffs imposed on Canada. One of them is Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who is in Nova Scotia for the Halifax International Security Forum, and he joins us right now. Hi, Senator. Thanks for being with us. Welcome back to Power Play.
Thank you. Great to be on with you, Mike.
So you've been one of the most vocal senators in D.C. opposing tariffs. It would seem now that public sentiment is kind of shifting in the U.S. Do you think that there's a better chance now of getting through to President Trump on reversing course?
Look, one of the things President Trump has believed in for decades is the power of tariffs to strengthen the American economy and drive reindustrialization. What I think is getting through is that Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate are hearing from our constituents that Trump ran on lowering our costs and making America healthy again, but he's doing the opposite. Our costs are going up because of tariffs, and lots of people are calling and complaining, and our healthcare system is a mess. So his popularity is going down, and I think more members of Congress are willing to stand up to him on the tariffs that are hurting both our economy and our close partnership, our alliance with Canada.
Do you think that that is the path to getting to him, either his popularity going down, or is it more on Republicans who can maybe pull him aside and have that conversation with him?
I think it's both. I think Republicans need to have private conversations with him to say tariffs are hurting a wide variety of the things that Americans say they care about most. For example, housing. A lot of what goes into American housing is lumber from Canada and wallboard from Mexico. And I frankly hope that President Trump rediscovers some pride in the USMCA, the deal, the trade and tariff deal that he signed as president his first term to provide tariff-free market access throughout North America between the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
There is that U.S. Supreme Court ruling in whether or not it's going to decide if imposing tariffs does truly lie in the power of Congress. So if it does rule that only Congress can impose those tariffs, what is your plan to prevent President Trump from possibly using another lever, like Section 232 tariffs of the Trade Expansion Act, which cites national security? Is there a path to prevent him from going there?
Look, when Trump imposed tariffs on Canada based on national security, the first time he was president, I'll never forget our meeting with a senior government minister at the time, expressing politely and appropriately the anger and the frustration of Canadians at being cited as a potential national security threat. I believe these were sanctions on steel and aluminum under Section 232. It is hard for us unless Republicans are willing to stand forward and speak out in opposition and vote in opposition. One positive sign, I think an encouraging one, is that the Senate has twice this year passed legislation saying that we oppose the tariffs that Trump has been imposing on Canada. Our challenge is the House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans, hasn't taken up that bill.
So how do you get them to take that up?
Frankly, they need to see and hear pressure from their constituents. The number one political issue in America was rising costs a year ago when Trump was elected, and we just had by-elections in a number of states, in Georgia, in Virginia, in California, in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, and across the country where Democrats did very well in all these elections, rising costs was cited as the #1 reason people came out and voted Democrat. So as we move towards our midterm elections next year, I'm hoping that that pressure on members of Congress and the administration will cause President Trump to reconsider moving towards a responsible, balanced trade deal with our vital partner and ally, Canada.
If you compare the first Trump presidency and this one now, do you have faith that the midterms will send some sort of a message to him to change course? And I only say that because I think from this side of the border, a number of Canadians look at it like there were people inside the White House that could maybe sway him one way or the other. And perhaps those same people aren't around now, or that President Trump knows the levers that he can pull this time and is simply ignoring anybody who says that he should change course.
Look, his cabinet this time is quite different from his cabinet the first time. Just to pick one example, Secretary Jim Mattis, a decorated 4-star Marine Corps general with decades of experience, was confirmed unanimously by the Senate. This time, Secretary Hegseth, a very different person with different level of experience, was barely confirmed by a 1-vote margin. That's the case across much of his cabinet. And frankly, he's governed in a much more imperious way, barely consulting with Congress, including members of his own party. So I would agree with your characterization that the circle right around him is much more loyalists and much less institutionalists. But I do think that the 2026 congressional elections may well deliver a real check on his power, just as the 2018 elections did. The most recent nationwide poll on which party is preferred in the upcoming elections for Congress has Democrats up double digits in one of the most promising polls I've seen in the last year.
Now, you're at the Halifax International Security Conference, and related to that, Canada is in the middle of making a decision on which fighter jet to buy. There's a Swedish delegation that was in Ottawa, including lawmakers and their king and queen, and there was a pitch to buy the European-made Gripen jet. Now, U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, has strongly hinted recently that if Canada's choice on that jet could impact the NORAD defense system, because, of course, you have the F-35s in the U.S. Do you agree with that our choice in which jet to buy would affect NORAD?
I'm not going to speak to that critical national security issue without better background for myself on exactly what would have caused our ambassador to make that comment. I think our alliance through NATO, our partnership in shared security in North America, and in particular, Canada's leading work in securing the Arctic, I think all argue in favor of our having a stable and sustained partnership where we find our way towards a trusted and open and transparent national security partnership. The Swedish Minister of Defense is here at the conference, and I recognize that the F-35 is an American-made but a multinational fighter that is the world's cutting-edge fighter. Of course, my hope is that Canada would procure the F-35, but frankly, Canada has to be free to make its own choice as a sovereign nation and as a NATO ally and partner of our country.
Before leaving you, I wanted to ask you one more question. Ambassador Hoekstra has often remarked here in Canada how surprised he is at the reaction of Canadians to this whole trade dispute, but especially on the calls for Canada to become the 51st state. Are you as perplexed as the ambassador at how Canadians are feeling right now vis-a-vis Canada-U.S. relations?
No, I'm not. Early on in this term, President Trump made a number of disparaging, aggressive, even offensive comments. Some in America have long ago, some in the United States, forgive me, have long ago gotten used to just dismissing comments by President Trump as, oh, there he goes again. Oh, that's just casual. But, you know, threatening to take Greenland from Denmark, threatening to retake the Panama Canal, threatening to make Canada the 51st state. These aren't funny. These aren't appropriate. And I am this week dealing with the fallout in Congress from President Trump making casual, I hope, threats that several of my colleagues, 2 senators, 4 members of the House, should be put on trial for treason. So I understand the ambassador, it's his job to put on a positive face and to improve relations. But I understand why Canadians were upset, even offended, by a number of comments President Trump made early in his term, suggesting that we would attempt to make Canada the 51st state. Anyone who knows Canadians, who understands Canada's deep pride and respects its sovereignty knows that that's not a laughing matter. This conference began with a film reminding us of the incredible hospitality shown at Gander after 9/11 to thousands of Americans and people from all over the world, a kind, gentle, but firm reminder that Canada has stood by us every time and it really mattered, and we should do the same to Canada and be good neighbors.
All right, we're going to leave it on that note. Democratic Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still ahead, we're going to dig into the interprovincial fight ramping up in Western Canada. We've got our front bench lined up today. We have Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, and Carl Belanger. First, though, we're going to go one-on-one with Federal Justice Minister Sean Fraser. Conversation about the hurdles facing his bail reform legislation and about the notwithstanding clause is just ahead. One of the priorities of the Carney government in this fall session has been strengthening bail laws and tackling hate crimes. Now, those are slowly working their way through the legislative process, including at parliamentary committees. Now, the federal government is also dealing with the provincial use of the notwithstanding clause. Some, including the federal government, have said that premiers are reaching for the constitutional tool just a little too often. That was part of my conversation with Canada's Attorney General and Justice Minister Sean Fraser. Hi, Minister. Thanks for being here and welcome back to Power Play.
A pleasure to be with you.
Now, I know your government is upset with some of the tactics that are being used right now in the Justice Committee by opposition parties to hold up some of the bills that you have coming through, specifically on combating hate and the other one on reform to bail and sentencing. But I have to ask you, is this not a little rich of your party, considering how long your government has taken to get to this point?
Well, look, respectfully, Mike, we have come back in this fall setting with a torrent pace of advancing legislation in addition to the federal budget that's just gone forward. For my part alone, we've introduced 2 bills so far in this setting, the Combating Hate Act, which, as you pointed out, is being held up by the Conservatives at the Justice Committee, as well as the Bail and Sentencing Reform Act. We're not done yet. In this fall setting alone, we expect to have a 3rd bill to be tabled in Parliament that's going to be addressing gender-based violence, protection for kids, and a number of other measures. And there can be no reasonable accusation that the government is taking too long to take action. We are actively working to put these measures forward to improve public safety in this country, and we hope we can earn the cooperation of all parties in the House of Commons.
Well, I'm saying that because it was in 2019 that your government brought in what was known as the principle of restraint, where courts were instructed to release people accused of a crime as early as possible with the least restrictive conditions. And then in 2023, you also had tried to make an attempt at stricter bail laws. So this is really your 3rd attempt at this. So can you really fault the Conservatives or other opposition parties for trying to do their job in this committee by making sure that they're doing all their checks and balances? Isn't this what they're supposed to be doing?
Well, let's be clear. The tactics that are frustrating the process have nothing to do with the legislation that is actually supposed to be considered. What's enormously frustrating is when you look at the fact that the Combating Hate Act has arrived before the committee and the House of Commons has directed them to study this bill to advance it so we can actually implement it in laws. It's not met with serious questions about the contents of the bill. We are now seeing extraneous motions being put forward on issues where the government and I personally have actually broadcasted we're going to do the very thing that the committee is apparently asking the government to do, only to slow things down so they can look at other issues. Through the conversations that I've had with colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I know that there is support for these bills, and I know that there are divisions within the Conservative caucus. And if combating hate against religious communities, against racialized communities is a political controversy for the Conservatives, then they have bigger problems than the motion that they're putting forward forward at committee in order to frustrate the progress of this legislation.
I'll just come back to my other point, though. This is really the Liberal government's third attempt at trying to amend some of these laws, specifically around bail reform and sentencing reform. I mean, so in a sense, can you really make the argument that others are trying to slow things down when your government has been slow enough in trying to actually get this law right?
Well, take a look at the difference in the measures that are included in the various bills that you're looking at. It's not as though that there was a decision taken years ago to take certain actions and they've been sitting dormantly. The bills that you're referring to tackled other, albeit related measures. For my own part, having come into this position just before the summer, I spent the months following my appointment immediately talking to law enforcement who work within the system, to provincial governments who have responsibility for administering the system, and use the perspectives of those with responsibilities for the justice system to actually inform the bill that we put forward. We're now seeing that police associations, provincial governments are standing up and saying, we support this bill. We want all parties to cooperate to adopt it expeditiously. Whatever may have been debated years ago on related but separate items is not relevant to the conversation that we have a bill before the House of Commons now that should be studied, certainly, but advanced rapidly.
But with respect, isn't it relevant when you consider the fact that police chiefs in the past have been demanding these types of changes? And yes, they may applaud it now, but they were asking your government to do this the last time in 2023.
Well, I think we're dealing with separate issues here. Certainly, there are decisions that were taken in the past on the contents of particular bills that, in retrospect, could have been improved. We're doing that work now, taking in the perspectives of different actors within law enforcement and within the justice system to ensure that we get this right. But the problem that we're dealing with at the Justice Committee now has absolutely nothing to do with the content of the bills that are being put forward. It's the idea that the Conservatives are reaching for extraneous issues, trying to bring them before the committee in order to delay the consideration of these important bills, which seemingly they've been asking for a number of years. If they actually had serious questions about the bills themselves, if they wanted to call additional witnesses to better understand the contents of the proposed laws, that would be one thing and I could accept it. But when I see them bringing new motions on unrelated items for the purpose of slowing down the process of adopting reforms that law enforcement is asking for, the communities that are facing hate crimes are asking for, that is the source of the frustration, not the idea that they should take reasonable amounts of time to consider the contents of the bill itself.
I want to ask you about another very live debate around the provincial use of the notwithstanding clause. While Premier Danielle Smith has used it twice in the last month, is it not her right to do so?
The notwithstanding clause, it exists within the Constitution, and no one is disputing that. But I have some real concerns on the regularity with which we're seeing the notwithstanding clause being used as a tool of first resort to deal with very complex and challenging social issues. You've got to understand that the notwithstanding clause exists within a constitutional structure that already allows governments to adopt laws that impact the rights and freedoms that Canadians enjoy, so long as the laws that they adopt are reasonable limits that are demonstrably justified within a free and democratic society. Now, I don't know about you, but I think being reasonable in a free and democratic society is a pretty low floor that we should insist governments abide by in all instances. When you use the notwithstanding clause, it's because you are indifferent as to whether the laws that you're adopting could actually be considered reasonable in a democratic society. My own view is that we should strive first to actually comply with the constitutional rights which Canadians are guaranteed under the Charter as we seek to address those complex legal issues, rather than using a sledgehammer when a scalpel may be more appropriate.
I'm asking you about this because I wonder whether or not there's a higher level of political consideration around opposing Alberta here and a couple of other provinces, but really when you compare it to Quebec, because it did take your Liberal government years to join in the challenge on Bill 21, known as the secularism law. So are you applying a different political lens because you have a lot more votes in Quebec than you do in Alberta?
No, and look, let me just clarify the record. I have a positive working relationship with my counterpart in Alberta, Minister Amory. I found him to be a terrific partner when it came to informing the work on the Bail and Sentencing Reform Act, and I think we need to look at the individual issues in isolation. Keep in mind, typically when you're dealing with these disputes as a matter of pieces of litigation, it's often the case that the federal government will allow the residents of a given Northern Province to take part in the litigation that may unfold at lower levels of court. Of course, now with the Bill 21 issue that you mentioned, that it's arrived before the Supreme Court of Canada, the federal government is certainly going to be making interventions. But what I find troubling today that 5 years ago perhaps was not quite as present in our everyday conversations is the regularity with which the notwithstanding clause is being used to tackle a broad range of issues by different governments across the country. This is something that is not an issue as between federal and provincial governments. The use of the notwithstanding clause is an issue that should be considered by both levels of government to be reserved for very rare sets of circumstances where the constitutional architecture is not equipped to be dealing with the kinds of challenges that governments seek to address. So it's really the more recent and frequent use of the notwithstanding clause that shows that indifference towards the rights of Canadians as government seeks to adopt laws that gives me great cause for concern in more recent months.
So do you have an issue with the frequency as opposed to the basis upon which they use it? Because, again, I go back to the secularism law where the Liberal government and whoever was Justice Minister at the time, I believe it was Minister Lametti, basically sat on the sidelines as that was being used and as the notwithstanding clause was being invoked before that bill even made it through, in a similar way to what Danielle Smith is doing now. I'm just trying to figure out how there's a difference in how your government has acted.
The frequency is one part of the challenge that I see, but I am yet to have observed an instance where the notwithstanding clause has been invoked by any government since I've been elected a little more than 10 years ago, where I saw it as an appropriate use. For my part, again, having come into this particular position after an election where I'd remind you we have a new government with a new Prime Minister as well, I can only govern myself in accordance with the opportunities that come before me. We've made the decision to intervene before the Supreme Court of Canada when we're dealing with a law that was put forward by the province of Quebec. I'm willing to speak publicly when it comes to the invocation of some of those, that same provision rather, in a different context with other provincial governments. But the reality is this isn't about any challenge that I may have with one provincial government or another. I want to foster a positive working relationship with all of my counterparts, but this is about defending the Constitution. This is about standing up for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and ensuring that we don't reach for the notwithstanding clause, which does not suspend Canadians' rights, but instead allows a law to operate, notwithstanding that that law may violate those rights which continue to exist. At the end of the day, we have to recognize that if we are not careful, our rights will be chipped away bit by bit until they are gone. I don't fear that our society will fall apart at the hands of some dictator on the other side of the world, but instead by some future government that is empowered by an erosion of our rights today. It's a responsibility that I have as Attorney General to defend the Constitution and the Charter, and I'm going to do that, discharge my responsibilities to the best of my ability.
Okay, Minister, we're all out of time. I appreciate you taking the time, though. Sean Fraser, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, thanks so much for being here. Thank you for the opportunity. Time for a quick break. When we come back, throwing pipeline punches. The political battle between Alberta and BC is ramping up as the feds weigh a potential exemption on the tanker ban on BC's west coast. So do the feds need to step in and ease the tensions? Well, the front bench is with us here. You got Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, and Carl Boulanger. They're going to join us after a quick break.
I've reached out to Ottawa to express that business in British Columbia should be discussed with British Columbia at the table. That message was delivered by me unequivocally to senior ministers within the government, and I'm assured was passed on to the Prime Minister. My sincere hope is that Ottawa recognizes both the jurisdiction of British Columbia and also the common sense that you might want to check with the locals if you're discussing policy in their province.
That was BC Premier David Eby saying he has reached out to the federal government after he claimed yesterday that he learned about the details of a memorandum of understanding between Alberta and Ottawa through the media. Multiple provincial and federal government sources have told CTV News that the deal could include changes to the industrial carbon price and support for a new pipeline to the west coast. Now, that pipeline would require an exemption of the federal tanker ban on BC's western coast. Eby is against that move and has called out Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, accusing them of thinking they know better. Here's how Premier Smith responded today.
This is what Team Canada looks like, that when you've got provinces that don't have access to a shoreline, we cooperate to make sure that we can get our products to market. We used to be able to do that fairly easily in the past, and we haven't been able to do it in recent years. The way you get new markets is you have to be looking either to the west, to Asia, or to the east, to Europe. And so, yeah, it means that you're going to have a variety of infrastructure crossing borders.
So how should Prime Minister Mark Carney navigate this latest pipeline battle? Well, let's bring in our front bench. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's a senior advisor at North Star Public Affairs. Melanie Paradis is a former communications director to Aaron O'Toole. She's now the president of Texture Communications. And former interim NDP national director Carl Belanger is here. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. Welcome to Friday, everyone. Sabrina, as a Liberal in Alberta, this is quite the conundrum. How do you think that Carney should handle all this?
I think there's a couple of different interesting things at play. So let me start first with Danielle Smith. I think that Danielle Smith's negotiation style, when it has come to this pipeline in particular, has not been very welcoming to the rest of Canada. She has set it up as though this, whether or not we build this pipeline is a test of whether or not this country can succeed and is really a country to begin with. I think that that's a setup that's doomed to fail because I don't think that other Canadians perceive it that way. I think it sets us up as us versus them, you know, Alberta versus Canada, and I don't think that anyone is interested in that. And I think it feeds into this fodder that Alberta, you know, is only really in it for itself. What she could be doing instead is framing this from a nation-building perspective, tied to pathways, which I think, you know, helps Canadians see where Alberta is going on the emissions reduction and actually bringing something positive to the country. I think that is where Danielle Smith often fails, and I think that that continues to be her style. On the other hand, I think Mark Carney, I'm not entirely sure what the win is for Mark Carney on this. If he negotiates an MOU and doesn't actually go through with it, I think that sets him up to not necessarily fail in Alberta, but continue to make Alberta, you know, equally successful at pointing fingers at Ottawa and saying that Ottawa is the problem maker here. But if he, and in addition to which, if he sets it up and wins on a pipeline, he risks losing those seats in BC that we are very tenuously holding on to as Liberals. And so I think that there needs to be a little bit more thought given from the federal Liberals as to what is the actual win here, but also what are the objectives that we want to achieve.
Melanie, can we really call it the wrong play by Smith if she may have an MOU in her hand right now? I mean, isn't that the win?
It absolutely is a win, but I think more importantly, a pipeline project for Alberta is bigger than Alberta and bigger than a pipeline. It's also symbolic, I think, to the rest of the country, because for 10 years, we've been gripped by a culture of no, where it seems like absolutely nothing could get built in this country. There'd be NIMBYs stopping housing projects. There's people who are trying to stop pipelines. People are opposed to everything, it seems. And Canada really has an important moment right now where we have a tremendous amount of momentum. The polling has showed that Canadians want to see major projects built from coast to coast. That includes pipelines. We're seeing opinions shift on pipelines in such a positive direction. This is a moment that really needs to be seized so that we can get major projects like this built. I think that Danielle Smith is absolutely right to be pushing her agenda forward. And I think that Mark Carney is taking a smart approach here. And what I hope that he's doing is that he's going to confront that culture of no and shift Canada towards a culture of yes. Yes, and these projects can be the safest and the best and the cleanest in the world.
And so that culture of no, or at least the one no that we have, Carl, is on the West Coast. It's the NDP Premier, David Eby. How's he supposed to feel in all this when you consider that he's learning Scott Moe, the Premier of Saskatchewan, was apparently at the table and he wasn't?
Yeah, do you see that monkey on my back? No, you don't, because Mark Carney took it and put it on David Eby's back. He's the guy saying no now. It's not the Fed's fault, and you can see Danielle Smith and David Eby going at it at each other. It's not the federal government. We were willing to play. So that was a clever move that Mark Carney did. Now, of course, it comes with a price, and British Columbia will react strongly. And you heard Premier Eby, and he was on the show here last night. But you also have First Nations in British Columbia that are not happy about this move. So how do you navigate this? Well, for now, it's a fight between BC and Alberta, and I think it's interesting that Premier Eby says, I want to be at the table. If he wants to be at the table, it means he's open to something. What is that? We don't know. But he's open to talk, at least, and that's progress. And for Daniel Smith, I would take that and invite him to the table.
Yeah, and have that conversation, Sabrina, because if, to Carl's point, if he wants to talk and it's not a non-starter, then maybe there's an opening?
Yeah, and I don't disagree with Mel's point that we want to create a culture of yes. And I think that the Major Projects Office and the 10 major projects that are already on the list are creating a culture of yes. I think the idea that the only pipeline project that matters to this country is this supposed no proponent oil pipeline to the West Coast is the problem here that Alberta continues to put forward. I do also think that if Premier Smith is serious about this, that she should have a working group that's either active in BC, but also active with coastal First Nations. Alberta has generally built a very good relationship with its First Nations, and I think that they could take that to the coast if they wanted to, but none of that's happening, right? And that's where I think that sometimes Premier Smith's intent on actually producing a project versus intent of producing a political communications game where we can point to Ottawa is at question. There's still no proponent. There's still, I think 30% X room on TMX that could grow our oil exports to Asia. So again, what is the project that we're talking about? And I think that's where the Premier often fails.
Mel, I got about a minute. I'm trying to split it between you and Carl. So do you think that she is playing this game still, or do you think that this is actually moving along the way that it can move along? Because she said, Alberta's a proponent right now, and she's looking to create the conditions for private investment.
Absolutely. The past decade has been lost to development because of the Trudeau government. And now we are seeing industries the reason why there's no proponent is because the conditions for the past decade have been terrible for developing a project like this. So Alberta is taking a leading role, creating what I assume is going to be a corridor where a proponent could then come in and say, okay, you've got the corridor lined up, you got everything, you got the deal with the federal government, we're good to go. This looks like a solid investment to me.
Carl, wrap us up in 30.
Well, I mean, the key for the federal government, of course, is to make sure that British Columbia doesn't get in a position where they get their backs up and they refuse to talk. And so Premier Eby has opened that door. You have to seize that door. Don't let this drag, because if it drags on and deals are being made and memorandum are being signed, you're going to end up in the courts for a very long time.
Yeah. And either in the courts or you just won't be at that table anymore.
That's right.
And there's decisions being made without you. All right, Carl Boulanger, Melanie Paradis, and Sabrina Grover, thank you all for being here. Coming up, no longer on the defense, about our defense spending. Well, after years of criticism, Canada says it will reach its NATO target by this fiscal year. So what do our allies think of it? Latvia's Defense Minister Andris Spruts joins us next. Defense officials and industry leaders from around the world are in Halifax at the Halifax International Security Forum. Now, they're there as Canada has promised to reach its NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on national defense. That's going to happen this year, and the promise to hit 5% by 2035. So what do our allies think about all of those revised targets? I spoke with Latvian Defense Minister Andris Spruts earlier today. Hi, Minister. Welcome to Power Play. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start with the proposed peace deal for Ukraine, or the plan at least. What are your concerns about what we are reportedly seeing on the table right now?
Well, what we see, it's unofficial. And of course, the principles remain the same for us, namely that the peace must be justified and just. It must be sustainable, and it must be peace which is being agreed upon by Ukraine and also by European countries. So it's not just the peace which can be agreed by Russia. So the peace settlement, of course, has much wider consequences. And first of all, Ukrainians decide on a just peace settlement.
But are you at all concerned by some of the proposals we're seeing in there? And I want to center in on one of them here. One of them that Ukraine would give up its aspirations to join NATO, and it would also force NATO to agree not to station troops in Ukraine. Are those acceptable in your mind?
Well, what is acceptable for us and what's acceptable for Ukrainian side is that territorial integrity must be complied with, it must be observed. It is absolutely the holy principle of international relations, of international system which is based on rules and norms. It is important that Ukraine remains country with sovereign decisions. So it's for NATO to decide, of course, to take Ukraine now or later. It's a formula which exists already within NATO when conditions allow and allies agree. But it's for Ukrainian side to have sovereign decision on what way to go, what kind of associations, what kind of membership it wants to be part of, what it aspires for. So sovereignty, territorial integrity, the size of its domestic decisions on army are absolutely the prerogative of Ukrainian people.
But how concerned are you about that issue of them having to renounce any kind of membership to NATO? Because you in the past have said it will happen sooner or later. And a lot of people in the region have seen their membership in NATO as being key to try and ensure peace in the region.
The key is, first of all, a strong Ukrainian army, armed forces of Ukraine, and Latvia and also the allies in the Baltic region and widely also in NATO will do everything to support Ukraine and to make strong Ukrainian armed forces. But yes, the membership of NATO, the membership of EU is important for Ukraine to be on security side, to be guaranteed also by its partners, and we will be supporting it. But yes, at the very end, it is also the decision by the NATO members, by NATO allies, to agree what and how it will be implemented. So that's why for us, again, sovereign decision of Ukrainian side is prerogative, it's a privilege, it's absolutely the right for Ukraine to decide what and how it goes.
I completely understand why it is Ukraine's decision, but how much of a loss to the region could it be, or would it possibly be, if they were not allowed to be in NATO?
Well, Ukrainian army now is one of the strongest armies in Europe, and it has proven that it's able and it has a determination to fight for its independence, to fight for democracy, to fight for European and generally democratic values and freedoms, to fight for the rules-based international order, and that's why it is important that Ukraine remains the sovereign right to choose its path towards different memberships. As I said, of course, those organizations may decide in a due time, so how it is being implemented, but for Ukraine there must be the right and privilege to go in that direction. So it would be, I think, the loss if we are somehow deciding to preclude Ukraine from the sovereign decision to move towards organization, which actually would be made stronger by the membership of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. The whole issue around defense spending has been a contentious one within NATO. Your country spends right now 3.73% of your total GDP on national defense. And this year, your government announced that you're going to increase that to 4.91% next year. Canada just hit the 2% target this year, and the plan is for Canada to hit 5% in 2035. What is your message to NATO members like Canada at this time when defense spending has seemingly never been more important, and at the same time the threat is ever present?
Latvia takes it very seriously. We realize the importance of investing in our defense. The less we invest now, the more of the costs will be in the future. So the more we invest now, the more secure it will be in the future. So that's why investment must be done right now. Latvia is doing it. This year, almost 4%, as you mentioned. Next year, it will be almost 5%. And in 2027, we aspire to reach 5% for the core defense spending. And we realize that, of course, we need to invest in our capabilities, we need to invest in our human resources and our people, but we need to invest also in a host nation status. And here I also come to Canada. Canada is doing a great job in being a leading nation in Latvia, in a multinational brigade. More than 2,000 Canadian soldiers are stationed in Latvia. Mm-hmm. We treat them and we believe and perceive them as their own family. So absolutely we realize that Canada is doing a good contribution. But yes, at the same time, of course, we encourage every nation to contribute to NATO because it is about collective defense. It is about collective deterrence. So investment by all nations is very crucial. We can do it in different way, but also financial investments show the will, show determination, show the understanding, and exactly provide opportunity for building up a strong, efficient capability. So that's why, yes, we encourage, but we highly appreciate what Canada is doing, and we are also happy that every nation in NATO this year will reach 2%. So we have done with the first commitment, we have succeeded, but of course next commitments are on the table and we have to achieve them. The sooner, the better.
How much sooner would you like to see Canada hit 5% in terms of that target?
Well, it's of course for Canada to decide what is the timetable and what are specific steps forward. We fully realize that it is important, of course, the timetable is the next decade in general. Again, once more, we encourage and underline the importance of doing it as soon as possible. But every nation also, of course, has its specific domestic circumstances, also the capabilities and traditions within army. So there is diversity, and we must respect also this diversity. But we are one for all for one alliance. So the benefit of one nation would also serve benefit to other nations. So we are mutually interconnected in our security aspirations. So here, yes, the sooner we reach all 3.5% for core defense, plus 1.5% for security or defense-related issues, the more secure we will be in a world which is not just about Russia, but in a world which is generally much more insecure, unstable, and there are a number of revisionist countries, which what we are facing and what we have to be ready for.
I guess I'll just phrase it this way.
To protect our people.
I'll just phrase it this way, though. How urgent is the need to scale up that spending as quickly as possible before that target of 5% is supposed to be in a decade, in 2035? I mean, if your country is trying to reach 5% next year, how quickly do you want to see everybody else scale up? Because in 10 years, a lot can change, obviously.
So the sooner the better. So yes, you mentioned about the next decade or by 2035, but the real contribution, real commitment, real investment must be done in coming 2, 3, 4 years. Sometimes we have those assessments that Russia might be ready to challenge NATO in 3, 4, 5 years' time. I always say, look, I mean, Russia is not a gentleman. We will not agree on some specific date. We must be ready to fight tonight. So that's why the sooner we invest today, the more ready we'll be also ready to fight tonight if necessary. And the more ready we are to fight tonight or tomorrow, the more we are capable actually to show very strong signal of deterrence. It is the insurance police, it is the insurance activity which actually provides deterrence and very much deter Russia from even thinking about somehow challenging NATO collective defense alliance.
Minister, I appreciate your time and thanks for joining us. Minister of Defense for Latvia, Andris Spruds, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Time for one more commercial break and Power Play. We'll be right back after this. And that is your Power Play Week in Politics. Thanks so much for spending your time with us. Have yourselves a great weekend and stay tuned because our top stories are just ahead.